Jim, thank you very much indeed, and thank you to you, to the Open Society Justice Initiative, and to the Brookings Institution for the initiatives to develop these very important reports and to convene today's meeting. I'm very grateful also to have the opportunity to comment. Let me start with a few general observations which are equally applicable whether we're speaking about views regarding individual communications or concluding observations. In other words, all the outputs of the treaty bodies. The first is that the issue of implementation is a function of very many considerations. Some of those are at the national level, some at the level of the treaty bodies themselves, some within the Secretariat in OHCHR, and some at what I suppose I could term the inter-mechanism level, the relationship of the treaty bodies with other human rights oversight and protection mechanisms at the regional and the international level. By way of example, what are some of these elements at various levels? First, there's the national level, where it's critically important that at the national level generates the materials and the information and the willingness to engage with the treaty bodies that is absolutely fundamental to their doing a quality job. Second, at the level of the treaty bodies themselves and their Secretariat, it's critically important not only that high-quality outputs are constructed and delivered, but that there is also a willingness to invest energy and effort in the follow-up of those outputs. And at the inter-mechanism level, the issue of complementarity arises, how the various mechanisms can mutually support each other. And to a very large extent, I think that's on the agenda for tomorrow morning, so I won't say more about it just now. Now, I begin with these highly generalized, not terribly specific observations to recall that every one of the issues I've just listed, be it the improvement of the national level engagement, the strengthening of the treaty bodies themselves, the strengthening of their secretariats, all of these elements are currently under review in what is, as of yet, a largely informal, but very vigorous discussion and reflection on how to strengthen the treaty body system. This was mentioned by the Deputy High Commissioner earlier this morning. This current phase of discussion on the reform of the system began with a call from the High Commissioner a little bit over a year ago and was followed up mainly by treaty body members, but by no means exclusively. There's also been a lot of activity by national institutions and NGOs in the context of meetings in Dublin, in Marrakesh, in Poznan, and in other locations. And so I make this point at the outset to suggest that what we're doing today fits very appropriately and very coherently and very usefully in a bigger discussion of how the treaty body system can be strengthened. Now, if I might turn more specifically to the issue of views, the outputs as a result of the consideration of individual communications. Well, at the outset here, I welcome the OSI Justice Initiative report. I think it's really important. I think it's very valuable. It's one of the best analyses of this specific issue that we have as of yet. I think it's a spur to, it's a wake-up call and a reminder to us all to get cracking on dealing with what ultimately is all that matters about these mechanisms. I was as shocked as I think many of you would be by the conclusions here that just a little over 12% of views are recorded as having been implemented, and perhaps even more disturbingly, that some 35%, the output of 35% of views remains impossible to discern. What to say about those figures? I would begin by saying that I accept that they indicate a very grave problem. It would be a fool to dispute that. I would also, however, suggest that figures are not quite as drastic as these bare statistics might suggest. And the report is quite balanced in the way in which it nuances the statistics. But just by way of two counterpoints to keep in mind when one looks at these figures. Firstly, there's the nature of the materials from which the statistics are derived, and that is the reports by the committees on the implementation of follow-up procedures. And These are extremely difficult reports to interpret. They've developed historically in a rather curious way. They do not generate the sort of easily assimilable statistics which would be useful for us to draw firm conclusions. In this context, for example, just by way of one example, when they describe the dialogue as ongoing with a particular country, that does not necessarily indicate a failure. It does not necessarily indicate non-compliance. Why? Two things to keep in mind. First, there is no reflection in the designation dialogue ongoing of the length, the duration of time since the decision was adopted. It's a term used equally for a communication adopted 6 months ago and 6 years ago. And I think one would have to accept that the length over which dialogue is ongoing is a critical element. But the statistics, unhelpfully, don't reflect that. The UN, the treaty body, published figures don't necessarily help in that regard. And secondly, the dialogue ongoing designation does not capture the very common reality of partial implementation. Where a treaty body in its remedy proposes 3 or 4 different actions, it may well be, and quite commonly is the case, that 1 or 2 of those actions will indeed be implemented by the state, but there'll be a sticking point on 1 or 2 others. Now again, the figures we use, at least in the Human Rights Committee, are not terribly useful in that regard, because even in a case where there has been this partial implementation, or if I might term it otherwise, partial success, it's still recorded as a dialogue ongoing case, and therefore could be understood to be a story of failure. So in terms of the statistics, though I in no way question the serious conclusions drawn, I suggest that the figures we generate, at least in the Human Rights Committee, do not make your job easy in drawing any statistical conclusions. So, that aside, since we accept that we've got problems, what is wrong? Let me return to the various levels of my initial points in terms of the extent to which implementation is a question of national actions, treaty body actions, secretariat actions, and so forth. So first, what's wrong at the national level? Undoubtedly at the national level, the issue of political will to implement findings and views is in the first instance, critically important. The country is not willing to implement, implementation will not take place. OSI has very helpfully identified the extent to which a strong rule of law and commitment to rule of law and rule of law sector plays an important role here in improving the likelihood of implementation. A second issue at the national level of the likelihood of implementation has to do with the point that Jim just touched on the mechanisms by which the state is in a position to receive treaty body findings. The method by which a state receives the findings as a matter of law vary quite enormously from state to state. And Jim gave some examples to illustrate this. And I'll come back to a couple of specific ideas on this in a moment. And so these are considerations of why what's happening now is less successful than it might be at the national level. Turning to the treaty body level, what's wrong now, or what at a minimum is a consideration of why the story is so disappointing? Well, firstly, there is the fact, of course, that ultimately one has to accept that the views adopted in the individual communication procedures are recommendatory in nature. Now, there's many people know how vigorous the academic debate is on the status of treaty body views and the extent to which some elements of treaty body activity may or may not be binding on states. I don't want to go into that now in any detail, but one has to accept that it is at least the view of most states that the views adopted are recommendatory. And this is an important element in determining why so often they are not implemented. Next, at the level of treaty bodies, I agree with Jim that we have to look at the nature of the remedies that are specified by the committees. And when I say committees here, I have to say, well, I'm predominantly talking about the Human Rights Committee. I don't, frankly, have the competence to speak in any detail about the other committees. But at that level of the Human Rights Committee, our remedies could do with considerable improvement. In the first place, we need to look one has to accept that the discrete remedies proposed to deal with particular fact situations are not as consistent as they might be across similar situations. One has to ask the question of whether the specification of compensation should be specified. And that's an open issue. I don't have a fixed view on it. And we also need to explore the utility of the very common device adopted by the Human Rights Committee of calling for unspecified remedies, simply saying justice shall be done, or words to that effect. It's been suggested that this is not particularly helpful to states. And then finally, in terms of the treaty body level actions in constructing the views, one has to engage with the suggestion made by Jim that it might help if the committees adopted more reasoned decisions. I'm ambivalent on this. A lawyer from a position of pure legal elegance would, of course, strongly argue that this is exactly what we need. But when one operates in an 18-member body from all regions of the world and all legal systems of the world, and one is seeking a common ground in order to address what everybody agrees is a flagrant violation of a treaty, sometimes those motivations overwhelm any desire for an elaborate array of detail which would trip up any possibility of an agreement across such a disparate body. But as I say, I'm quite ambivalent on that. Turning to the third and final treaty body level area of consideration when one tries to assess what's going wrong now, the issue of the follow-up procedures, I'd make a few suggestions, or I introduce a few observations. Firstly, we, at least in the Human Rights Committee, operate with just one rapporteur for the follow-up of views. One rapporteur designated in the committee to consider all views adopted over all time. It has been said, and it's widely agreed, that it's not possible for a single human being to oversee the degree of follow-up required to address what are, I figure we heard, 546 cases so far. Secondly, that one rapporteur is supported by a tiny support capacity from OHCHR, not the fault of OHCHR. It doesn't have the resources. It would like to devote more attention to follow-up. It does a superb job within the limits of its capacities. But the capacities themselves are entirely inadequate to the project. The Human Rights Committee operates, and I'm wary of giving a figure with an array of senior OHCHR people right in front of me, but I think it's we operate with perhaps 75% of a single staff member for follow-up, specifically for follow-up. And I'll happily stand corrected if I'm wrong, but everybody would agree that the capacity is woefully inadequate.